Welcome to the show. I'm Brenda with Daniel Weiss, Brian Newman, and Benny Fluman, and I want to start with a line that should make a lot of B2B leaders uncomfortable. Most companies try to lower friction by lowering price. Stripe kept premium pricing and removed pain somewhere else.
Right, and that somewhere else is the whole game. Most teams see stalled conversion and immediately reach for discounting, flexible terms, some promotional nonsense. Stripe's bet was the opposite. Don't cheapen the offer, compress the path to proof. Premium pricing without compressed time to value is arrogance.
Compressed time to value sounds nice, Benny, but buyers still push on price, especially in enterprise. So what's the actual mechanism here? Because if I'm an SDR leader and conversion is weak, the answer can't just be make the product feel easier.
No, not easier in a vague sense. Easier to verify. That's different. The core question is brutal. What if your pricing problem is actually an activation problem? If the customer cannot reach the moment of evidence fast enough, price becomes the argument because value hasn't shown up yet.
Let me sharpen that. In operational terms, activation is the shortest reliable path from sign-up to first meaningful outcome. For Stripe, that meant a developer could create an account, use documentation, implement, and process a first transaction in minutes, not after a 6-week implementation committee. That sequence matters because the first job of GTM is making value easier to reach than doubt.
The phrase easier to reach than doubt is the one that'll stick with me. Because doubt grows in waiting time, right? Not just in price discussions.
Exactly. Every extra handoff, sales call, solutions call, security review too early, onboarding friction, gives doubt room to expand. Stripe designed the motion so the user hit proof before internal skepticism fully organized itself.
But let's be honest, that's not every B2B sale. If you're selling a 6-figure platform into Germany or the US enterprise, no buyer is swiping a credit card after 10 minutes.
True, but that's also the lazy objection. Nobody's saying your ERP buyer becomes a self-serve checkout. The lesson is structural. Where is the first credible proof point in your journey, and how fast can a buyer touch it? Time to proof beats deck quality. Activation is not the full sale. It's the first commercial conviction event.
So for international B2B teams, the question isn't, can we become Stripe? It's, where are we forcing belief before evidence?
That's it. And too many companies are doing exactly that, asking buyers to trust pricing, roadmap, implementation, even ROI, before the buyer has experienced anything concrete.
Okay, Daniel, walk us through the sequence change, because this is where Stripe feels very different from traditional B2B.
Traditional motion is pretty linear. Sell, implement, maybe value. And that maybe is the expensive part. Stripe flipped it to activate, prove, expand. The user started using the system early, the system generated evidence, and only then did the commercial motion deepen.
I want to grab that word evidence, because that's what sales teams usually don't have. They're selling possibility. Stripe gave sales something better than a promise: usage data, transaction history, internal adoption signals.
Yes, and here's the executive line. They didn't remove sales, they hid sales inside implementation. That is a very different commercial architecture. The persuasive moment wasn't the demo theater. It was the customer already doing the work and seeing it function.
Hid sales inside implementation, meaning the implementation itself became the argument?
Correct. Implementation stopped being a post-sale cost center and became a pre-expansion revenue lever. That's why the model scales commercially. Usage created the pipeline, and sales monetized the evidence.
And I like that because it saves SDR and AE teams from a common trap. If I'm forced to create urgency from scratch, I'm basically manufacturing interest. But if the account already has live usage, a team using it, maybe revenue moving through it, now the conversation shifts from why buy to how much bigger can this get? That's a much better pipeline.
Exactly. And the monetization logic improves too. Premium pricing becomes more defensible after proof because the buyer is no longer comparing theoretical alternatives. They're comparing a live workflow against the risk of changing it.
I still want to push back on the label here. People hear this and say, great, product-led growth. I'm not sure that's right. Product-led makes it sound automatic, like the product just floats through the market by itself.
Good, because I don't think this is passive PLG mythology either. I think it's more deliberate. Founder-led activation in its original logic. The company decided very intentionally that the fastest route to trust was not persuasion. It was usable proof.
I agree with Brian on the caution, though. Product-led is often used as an excuse to underinvest in the operating model. Stripe's motion still required sequencing, documentation, onboarding design, developer experience, sales timing, expansion triggers. That's not accidental growth, that's engineered growth.
So let me try this back, maybe slightly wrong. You're both saying the product didn't replace GTM, it became the front end of GTM?
Almost. The part I'd add is timing. The product became the front end of proof, and GTM was reorganized around that proof. That's why activation matters more than the label.
And why time to proof is such a useful framing. Not time to demo, not time to proposal, time to proof. If your buyer can feel the outcome quickly, pricing tension drops. If they cannot, your reps get dragged into endless justification.
And then sales gets blamed for a problem they didn't create. My favorite kind of meeting.
Let's ground this in scale, because this is not some niche theory. Stripe's 2025 annual letter, published in February 2026, puts real numbers behind it.
The numbers are significant. Stripe said it processed $1.9 trillion in payment volume in 2025, up 34% year over year. It serves more than 5 million businesses. 90% of the Dow Jones companies use Stripe. 80% of the NASDAQ 100 use Stripe. And through Stripe Atlas, roughly 25% of Delaware corporations have been formed with Stripe involved in that setup path.
The 1.9 trillion number matters because that's not startup novelty anymore. That's a GTM system operating at massive trust scale. And the 90% of the Dow Jones piece tells you this wasn't just a developer toy that accidentally found enterprise.
Exactly. But let's use those numbers carefully. They prove the scale of the motion. They are not the origin story. The origin story is still activation. You don't get to 5 million plus businesses by asking every prospect to sit through a belief ceremony.
Brian, what does this mean for teams building pipeline across international markets, especially smaller companies?
It means stop confusing meetings with momentum. If I'm taking an Israeli B2B company into the US or Europe, I care about one thing early. Can the prospect get to a sharp proof point without getting trapped in our internal process? Because if every qualified conversation still needs 3 calls before the buyer can picture success, pipeline quality is going to look inflated and close rates will tell the truth later.
And from an operating model standpoint, that means you design activation on purpose. Define the ICP, define the first outcome, define the assets required to reach that outcome, then instrument it. Where do users stall? How long to first success? Which segment reaches proof fastest? This is not branding, it's revenue infrastructure.
Strategy-wise, I think leaders need to hear something uncomfortable. If your go-to-market depends on your rep explaining why the value will appear later, your commercial architecture is weak. The market is telling you that belief is too expensive. Activation reduces the cost of belief.
And I'll add a sales warning. Don't romanticize self-serve. In many B2B categories, a human still needs to step in and expand, negotiate, secure buying committee confidence. Fine, but step in after the signal. Usage created the pipeline, and sales monetized the evidence.
That's a very different way to look at growth. Not how do we persuade harder, but how do we shorten the distance between curiosity and proof?
Yes, activation is the commercial bridge between attention and trust. And time to proof is now a board-level metric, whether companies admit it or not.
Here's the hard line then. If customers need a meeting to believe you, you do not have a pricing problem. You have an activation problem.
And if your first proof point arrives after procurement, congratulations, you've built a revenue obstacle course.
If you're seeing your team spend more energy persuading than helping customers prove value for themselves, that's the signal to stop and rethink your GTM. At Match B2B, We work with companies to identify where activation breaks, how to shorten time to proof, and how to turn what already exists in your go-to-market into a real engine for meetings, pipeline, and expansion. If you want to understand the untapped potential in your current infrastructure, it's worth starting with a conversation. Thanks for listening to Match B2B Insights.